Your grandmother was eating stolen food, and she never knew it. Every dish you call soul food, the gumbo, the greens, the black-eyed peas, was created by African hands in African kitchens centuries before America claimed it, and 25 of those original recipes have almost completely vanished. Number 19 has been on American breakfast tables for 200 years, and every single person who ate it thought it was Southern. Number 8 is the direct ancestor of a dish now served in 30 countries. And number 1, the last dish on this list, is the one historians say should never have survived at all. But it did. And once you hear why, you'll never look at your family's cooking the same way again. These are the 25 lost African-American recipes your grandparents knew. Let's bring them back. Number 25, African peanut butter stew, the dish that crossed the Atlantic and lost its name. Before peanut butter was an American lunchbox staple, it was a West African cooking fat, a sauce base, a protein source, and a survival food that crossed the Atlantic in the memory of enslaved people. This stew, known across the continent as groundnut soup or maf, depending on the region, is the oldest recipe on this list and the most quietly influential. Chicken or lamb simmered low and slow in a broth built from crushed peanuts, tomatoes, onion, garlic, and enough cayenne to wake up every nerve in your body. In the American South, this recipe transformed. The peanuts stayed. The slow simmering stayed. The tradition of cooking the protein until it fell apart into the sauce stayed, but the dish lost its name and its origin story, absorbed into Southern cooking without credit. Historians now trace peanut cultivation in the American South directly to African agricultural knowledge brought by enslaved people. They grew the peanuts, they cooked the stew, they fed the continent, and for 200 years, almost nobody knew to say thank you. Number 24, spicy tomato chicken pot, Sunday food, sacred food. Every culture that has ever lived near a wood fire has a version of chicken stewed in tomatoes. But the African-American version of this dish carries a particular heat and a particular depth that comes directly from the West African pantry. Chicken pieces browned in hot oil until the skin blistered and turned amber, then buried in a sauce of crushed tomatoes, Scotch bonnet pepper, onion, and garlic that had been cooked down until it was nearly a paste. Thick and dark and smelling like something that had been cooking for days even if it had only been an hour. This was Sunday food, not because it was complicated, but because it was sacred. The pot went on after church and it filled the house all afternoon with the kind of smell that brought people home. In West African households it was called stew. In African-American kitchens in Georgia and South Carolina, it became the base of every smothered dish that followed. The technique traveled. The memory held. Number 23. West African Jambalaya, Jollof-Style rice, the dish that survived the crossing inside human memory. The argument over which country makes the best jollof rice has fueled debates, memes, and one international diplomatic incident. Ghana, Nigeria. Senegal says the argument is beneath them because they invented it. But the historians say something else entirely. They say the rice dish that appeared in South Carolina and Louisiana in the 1700s, the dish Americans later called jambalaya, was already old by then. It had come on ships from Senegal, carried in the minds of people who had been cooking one-pot spiced rice for centuries before anyone in the New World had tasted it. Long-grain rice, toasted in oil with onions and bell pepper until it smelled nutty, then cooked in a tomato and broth base seasoned with thyme, bay leaf, and smoked paprika until every grain was stained red and flavored all the way through. Chicken, sausage, or shrimp added in the last 30 minutes. One pot, one spoon. The entire history of African food in America right there on the stovetop. Number 22. Slow-cooked beef and peanut gravy. The dish that patience built. Beef chuck cut into large pieces, seared until a dark crust formed on every side, then submerged in a gravy of crushed peanuts, onion, tomato, and beef broth and cooked on the lowest possible heat for 3 hours until the connective tissue dissolved and the meat became something between solid and liquid, something you could eat with bread or rice, or simply a spoon in a quiet room. The peanut gravy thickened as it cooked, absorbing the fat from the beef and deepening in color from pale tan to a rich dark brown that looked like it had been reducing for days. In Mali and Senegal, this is called maif. In African-American households across Alabama and Mississippi, versions of this dish appeared under different names. the peanut quietly present in the gravy without explanation, because some knowledge does not need a name. It just needs a pot and a low flame and someone who remembers. Number 21. African collard greens stew, the dish your grandmother made, and the older dish behind it. You know collard greens. You have had them at Thanksgiving, at church dinners, at your grandmother's table on Sunday. But the version of collard greens that most African Americans know, the long-simmered pot with smoked meat and pot liquor, is only half the story. The other half starts in West and East Africa, where dark leafy greens were stewed in rich broths with palm oil and spices and fermented locust beans into a dish that was already ancient when the first enslaved Africans arrived on American shores. This version adds back what the American adaptation left behind. The palm oil, red and rich, stirred in at the end to give the pot a deep color and a flavor that is earthy and complex in a way that bacon grease, as magnificent as it is, cannot replicate. Onion, garlic, tomato, a Scotch bonnet pepper split open and dropped in whole so the heat was present but gentle. The greens simmered until they were tender and dark and had collapsed into the broth, which by then was its own separate miracle. Elders called the broth pot liquor. Scientists would call it a concentrated source of every nutrient the greens contained. But at the table, they just called it the best part. For 300 years, black cooks in this country were feeding everyone except themselves. They cooked in plantation kitchens and hotel restaurants and White House dining rooms, and they were almost never credited for what they made. Their recipes were copied into cookbooks with no attribution. Their techniques were absorbed into Southern cuisine and called American. The cuisine that defines American comfort food has African roots that run deeper than most people ever learned in school. Every dish on this list is proof of that. Keep watching. Number 20. Spiced rice and meat skillet, Pilau style, the East African trade route on a plate. Along the East African coast, in Kenya and Tanzania, and the islands of Zanzibar, there's a rice dish called Pilau that smells like a spice market and tastes like the Indian Ocean trade routes that shaped the region for 1,000 years. Cinnamon, cumin, cardamom, black pepper, and cloves toasted whole in oil until they sputtered and filled the kitchen with something that was warm and exotic and ancient all at once. Then meat, usually goat or beef, browned in those same spices. Then rice, washed until the water ran clear, added and cooked in seasoned broth until each grain was separate and fragrant. This dish traveled differently than the West African recipes. It came through the Swahili coast, through the diaspora of East African communities, and it arrived carrying the proof that African food was never isolated. It was always in conversation with the world, absorbing spices from Arabia and India and sending its own flavors back in exchange. A senior who grew up eating pilau at their grandmother's table in Mombasa and now makes it in an apartment in Atlanta is not cooking a foreign dish. They are cooking home. Number 19. African breakfast grits, Ugali style. Before grits were Southern, they were African. Before you say anything, yes, grits and ugali are cousins. The grits that filled every Southern black kitchen for 200 years, that were simmered with patience and finished with butter and cheese, that were sacred before they were trendy, share their DNA with the stiff cornmeal porridge that is the staple food of 100 million people across East and Central Africa. Same grain, same technique, same role on the table, the anchor, the foundation, the thing everything else was built around. This version is cooked the African way, stirred constantly over high heat until it pulled away from the sides of the pot and held its shape, then served with a stew or sauce poured over the top, or eaten alongside braised greens and roasted meat. It is denser than Southern grits, more substantial, the kind of food that prepared you for physical work and kept you going through the afternoon. For African American families who ate grits every morning and never once questioned why, this is the original, the source, the thing their great-grandmothers were already making before the Atlantic crossing changed the name of everything. Number 18. One-pot chicken and groundnut sauce, a living thread from West Africa to 125th Street. There's a restaurant in Harlem that has served this dish under various names since 1962. The owner's grandmother brought the recipe from Savannah, Georgia. The grandmother's grandmother brought it from somewhere she was not allowed to name. The dish itself has been continuous, unbroken, a living thread that runs from West Africa through the American South, through the Great Migration, to a steam table on 125th Street where it feeds 100 people a day. Chicken pieces simmered until cooked through, then the broth used as a liquid base for a sauce of peanut butter, tomato, onion, and garlic that was cooked down until it was thick enough to coat a spoon. The chicken returned to the pot, turned in the sauce, finished with a handful of whatever leafy green was available. This was a dish that proved peanuts were not an American ingredient accidentally adopted by African cooks. They were an African ingredient brought to America, planted by African hands, cooked in African ways, and eventually credited to everyone except the people who started it. Number 17. Sweet plantain skillet. Not a banana. Never a banana. The plantain is not a banana, and anyone who grew up eating them will correct you about that without hesitation. It is starchier, denser, less sweet when green, and enormously sweet when black ripe. And it has been a staple food across West and Central Africa and the Caribbean for so long that it is impossible to trace its origin to a single moment or place. What is traceable is the moment it arrived in the American South with enslaved Africans from the Caribbean and became a quiet, uncelebrated part of black foodways that most food historians spent centuries ignoring. The sweet plantain skillet is the ripe version. Plantains sliced on the diagonal into thick rounds, fried in oil over medium heat until the outside caramelized and turned deep gold and the inside softened into something approaching custard. Some families added a pinch of cinnamon. Some added chili flakes for a sweet heat combination that made the whole skillet into its own argument about flavor. Served alongside rice and stew or eaten alone as a snack that disappeared from the pan before it reached the table. Every African-American grandmother who made this knew exactly what she was doing. She was cooking West Africa. Number 16. African red stew, tomato pepper base, the mother sauce nobody named. This is the mother sauce of African-American cooking, though it has never been called that. Every smothered dish, every stewed chicken, every braised pork chop, every pot of beans that was built on a base of sautéed tomatoes and peppers traces its lineage back to this stew. The technique is West African. Ripe tomatoes, red bell peppers, and Scotch bonnet blended smooth and then cooked in oil, just oil, for 30 to 45 minutes, stirring constantly until the raw taste cooked out and the mixture reduced by half and turned from bright red to a deep burnished brick color that smelled caramelized and complex. That cooked-down tomato and pepper base became the foundation for everything else. Meat went in and braised in it, fish went in and poached in it, vegetables went in and absorbed it. The African-American kitchen adopted this technique wholesale and used it so thoroughly that it became invisible, just the way you made stew, just what cooking smelled like, just home. It was African technique. It remained African technique. It just lost its passport somewhere along the way. There is a word used in food scholarship called culinary erasure. It means the process by which a cuisine loses its attributed origin, absorbed into a dominant food culture without credit. African-American food is the most extensively erased cuisine in the history of the United States. The okra in your gumbo is African. The black-eyed peas on your New Year's table are African. All of it traveled here in the minds and hands of people who were given nothing and created everything. Keep watching. Number 15. Village chicken and onion braise, Yassa style, the dish that remembers its own name. In Senegal, Yassa is what you make when you want to show someone they matter. The chicken is marinated overnight in a mixture of lemon juice, mustard, garlic, and so many sliced onions that the bowl looks more vegetable than meat. The next day, everything goes into a heavy pot over high heat. The chicken first to brown and blister, then the onions, reduced and caramelized until they're soft and golden and deeply sweet. Then the marinade, returned to the pot as a sauce that is bright and tangy and complex. This dish traveled through the African diaspora and left its fingerprints on American cooking in ways that were subtle enough to go unnoticed for generations. The practice of marinating chicken in acid before cooking it was considered a Southern technique. The tradition of using enormous quantities of onion as the flavor base of a braise was called Creole. The combination of lemon and mustard and chicken was called French. But it was Senegalese. It was Wolof. It was the food of the Senegambia region, brought here and absorbed and renamed as so many things were. Yassa remembers its own name even when the world forgot to use it. Number 14. African Gumbo-Style okra soup, the dish that named itself in an African language. The word gumbo comes from the Bantu word for okra, keen gombo. That is not a theory. That is etymology. It is documented. And it means that the dish most Americans associate with Louisiana Creole cooking is named in an African language because the dish itself is African in origin. Enslaved Africans from the Congo and Angola brought okra to the American South. They brought the technique of using it as a thickener. They built the first version of gumbo in plantation kitchens and called it by its African name, and 200 years later the name survived even when the credit did not. This version is closer to the original: okra, palm oil or vegetable oil, onion, tomato, smoked fish or crayfish, Scotch bonnet pepper, and whatever protein was available, all simmered together in a pot until the okra dissolved and thickened the broth into something viscous and rich and deeply flavored. No roux, no sausage, no file powder, just the original technique, intact, traveling across centuries from Central Africa to the Carolina coast to every gumbo pot in Louisiana history. Leah Chase knew this. She always knew. Number 13. One pot, coconut rice and chicken. The East African coast in a bowl. Along the East African coast, coconut milk is what the ocean gave you when you could not afford anything else. It was free, abundant, and it turned plain rice into something that tasted like a celebration. Chicken pieces browned in oil with garlic and ginger, then coconut milk poured in with long-grain rice and enough water to cook everything through. The coconut milk gave the rice a richness and a slight sweetness and an aroma that filled the house with something tropical and warm, and the chicken absorbed all of it, becoming tender and fragrant in a way that nothing else could accomplish. Swahili cooks called this dish wali wa nazi, rice of the coconut, and they made it for weddings and holidays and Sunday afternoons when the family was gathered and something special was needed. African-American families in coastal communities in Georgia and South Carolina had their own version of this dish, evidence of the East African trade routes that reached the American coast through the diaspora. It was not widely known. It was not written down, but it was made, quietly, in kitchens where people still remembered the coast from which they had been taken. Number 12. Rustic bean and palm oil stew, the original before the substitution. Palm oil is the most controversial ingredient in the African kitchen and also the most irreplaceable. It is red, almost orange, extracted from the fruit of the oil palm, and it carries a flavor that is earthy and smoky and slightly pungent and completely unlike anything else in the culinary world. When enslaved Africans arrived in the American South and found no palm oil, they substituted bacon fat and lard, and the dishes they made were good. But they were not the same. Something was missing, and the people who cooked them knew exactly what it was. This bean stew uses palm oil the way it was always meant to be used, stirred into the pot in the last 10 minutes, not cooked through but warmed, so that its color bloomed through the beans and its flavor stayed bright and complex. Black-eyed peas or kidney beans cooked until creamy, onion, tomato, Scotch bonnet, the palm oil at the end, turning everything a deep amber, served over rice or with cornmeal. This is the original, the version that existed before substitution, the dish that West African grandmothers made before their grandchildren were taken away from them and had to improvise with what America offered. Number 11. African shepherd's pie, Bobotie style, 3 continents in one dish. South Africa gave the world Bobotie, and the world has mostly failed to acknowledge the gift. This dish, the national dish of South Africa, carries the genetic code of the Cape Malay community, descendants of enslaved people and political exiles brought to the Cape Colony from Indonesia, Madagascar, and East Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries. Ground beef or lamb spiced with curry powder, turmeric, ginger, garlic, bay leaves, and a handful of raisins for sweetness, cooked down into a rich, fragrant filling, and then topped with a mixture of egg and milk that baked into a savory custard. The result was something between a shepherd's pie and a curry and a soufflé, something that had no real equivalent in any other cuisine because it was made by people who carried the food memories of 3 or 4 different continents and combined them into something entirely new. African-American communities in coastal cities encountered this dish through maritime connections and Caribbean trade routes, and those who made it called it various things: a spiced meat pie, a curry bake, a holiday dish. The name Bobotie rarely traveled with it, but the flavors did, and they were unmistakable. When we talk about losing these recipes, we're not talking about losing cooking instructions, we're talking about losing a map. Every dish on this list tells you something about where people came from, what they valued, how they survived, what they refused to forget even when forgetting would have been easier. Food is memory encoded in flavor. That is why this list matters. That is why every dish your grandmother made matters. That is why you should write it down tonight. Keep watching. We're almost to the most important ones. Number 10. Spicy Pepper Soup Broth. The dish for every occasion, all at once. In Nigeria, pepper soup is what you drink when you're sick, when you're celebrating the birth of a child, when you need to sweat something out of your body, when it is cold and your bones ache, when a friend has died and the grief sits in your chest like a stone. It is medicinal and ceremonial and celebratory all at once, which means it is always the right thing to make. A broth built from goat meat or catfish or chicken, cooked with an unmistakable blend of spices that includes ehuru, uziza seeds, and uda pods. West African spices with no direct Western equivalent that produce a flavor simultaneously peppery and aromatic and slightly numbing in a way that clears your sinuses and your thoughts at the same time. African American families in the South who made this dish rarely had access to the original spices. They improvised with black pepper, allspice, and Scotch bonnet, and came close, always close, but close the way a photograph comes close to being the person in it. When African immigrants in American cities make pepper soup for the first time, and their African-American neighbors taste it and say, "I know this, I've had this before, somewhere," they are right, they have, through the blood, through the memory, through everything that survived the crossing. Number 9. African Fried Rice Skillet. High heat, deep memory. Every culture that has ever had leftover rice in a hot pan has invented their own version of fried rice. The West African version is older than most people realize and more sophisticated than it gets credit for. Day-old rice, which is dried slightly, so each grain is separate and will not clump in the pan, fried in hot oil with onion, garlic, bell pepper, tomato, egg stirred in to scramble through the grains and whatever protein was available from the previous night's dinner. The technique mattered more than the protein. The key was heat, high heat that made the rice sizzle the moment it hit the oil, that created a light crust on the bottom of the pan that was not burned but toasted, that gave the whole dish a smoky depth that low-heat cooking could never produce. West African cooks called this the bottom of the pot, and they fought over it the way Southern cooks fought over the corner piece of cornbread. The best bite in the whole dish. The part that tasted most like the fire it was made on. In African-American households, this dish appeared at breakfast, at lunch, at supper, as a side, and as a main. It traveled well. It lasted. It required almost nothing to make. It tasted like everything. Number 8. Simple cabbage and carrot stew, Atakilt style. The dish that traveled a different route. Ethiopia did not send its people to the Americas in the same way that West Africa did. Its recipes traveled a different route, through the diaspora of Ethiopian immigrants in the 20th century, through restaurant culture, through the slow spread of a cuisine so distinctive that once you have tasted it, you do not forget it. Atakilt is a vegetable dish so simple it barely seems like a recipe. Cabbage, carrots, and potato cooked in oil with garlic, ginger, turmeric, and cumin until everything was tender and fragrant and stained golden from the turmeric. No meat, no broth, just vegetables and spice, and the understanding that simplicity done right is not a compromise. This dish became part of African American cooking through community and connection, through Ethiopian restaurants that opened in cities during the 1970s and 1980s, and introduced an entire generation of Black Americans to food that felt familiar in its warmth and complexity, and completely new in its spicing. For families looking to stretch a food budget while eating well, Atakilt was a revelation. Cheap ingredients, deep flavor, nutritious enough to eat as a full meal, beautiful enough to serve to guests, a dish that the whole diaspora adopted because the diaspora always recognized when something was good. Number 7. African Meatball Tomato Stew. The cinnamon was the tell. Across North Africa and into the Sahel, meatballs and spiced tomato sauce are called kefta, or various regional names, and they appear in some form in nearly every cuisine that has ever existed between the Mediterranean and the equator. The African-American version came through multiple routes, through the Moorish influence on Iberian cooking that then traveled to the Americas, through North African communities and coastal cities, through the inevitable convergence of people who all independently discovered that seasoned ground meat cooked in tomato sauce was one of the most satisfying things a human being could eat. Ground beef mixed with onion, garlic, parsley, cumin, paprika, and cayenne, rolled into balls no larger than a walnut, browned in oil until a dark crust formed. then simmered in a tomato sauce built from crushed tomatoes, more onion and garlic, a pinch of cinnamon that seemed wrong until you tasted it and understood. The cinnamon was the tell. That was the North African fingerprint, the spice that did not belong in a European tomato sauce but was completely at home in an African one. In kitchens in Atlanta and Chicago and Detroit where this dish was made, nobody called it North African. They just called it good. Number 6. Cornmeal dumplings and stew. African knowledge. American corn. One genius combination. Cornmeal is African American. That sentence is not as simple as it sounds. Corn itself is indigenous to the Americas. But the techniques for making cornmeal into something edible, into porridge and dumpling and flatbread, came from African agricultural traditions that already had centuries of experience with sorghum and millet and knew exactly how to process a coarse grain into food. Enslaved Africans took the corn that was given to them as rations and made it into something their captors had not imagined because they brought knowledge that had been built over generations with different grains. These cornmeal dumplings were made by mixing coarse cornmeal with a little salt and just enough boiling water to bring it together into a stiff dough, then rolling it into rounds and dropping them into a pot of simmering stew to cook through, absorbing the broth as they went. They were not fluffy, they were dense and filling and deeply satisfying in the way that only a food made from almost nothing can be deeply satisfying, because every bite was proof that something good could be made from almost nothing. That knowledge was African, that technique was African, the corn was American, the genius was the combination. Number 5. African chili, bean, and meat stew. Before it was Texas, it was West Africa. American chili is a Tex-Mex dish with African DNA. The combination of beans and meat stewed together in a spiced broth has roots in West African cooking that predate the American Southwest by centuries. The specific technique of browning meat in fat, building a spiced tomato base around it, and adding beans to stretch the protein through the pot is documented in African cooking traditions long before it appeared in Texas cookbooks. What changed in the American version was the spice profile and the substitution of chili pepper varieties native to the Americas for the Scotch bonnet and suya spice blends of West Africa. But the architecture of the dish, the logic of it, was African. This version returns to the African spice profile: cumin, coriander, smoked paprika, a Scotch bonnet split and added whole, kidney beans cooked until they were creamy and absorbed all the flavor the pot had to offer, ground beef or lamb browned deeply before anything else was added, tomato paste cooked directly in the oil for 5 minutes before the liquid went in, concentrating its sweetness and cutting its acidity. This is not Texas chili, and it is not Mexican chili. It is what chili was before it was renamed. Number 4. Sweet millet breakfast porridge. The grain that history forgot to mention. Millet is the grain that history forgot to mention. It is one of the oldest cultivated crops in the world, grown in Africa for 10,000 years before any of the grains that fill American grocery stores were domesticated. It was a staple food in West Africa long before corn arrived from the Americas, and the knowledge of how to cook it traveled with enslaved Africans to the New World. But millet was not available in the American South the way it had been in West Africa, and so the tradition slowly shifted to cornmeal, which could be processed in the same ways. This porridge, made from millet flour or whole millet grain simmered with water, a pinch of salt, and enough sweetener to make it something you wanted to eat in the morning, rather than something you had to eat, is an act of restoration. It is the original before the substitution. Warm and slightly nutty, thickened to the consistency of a loose oatmeal, poured into a bowl and served with fresh fruit or a drizzle of extra honey. For any family reclaiming this dish, it is breakfast, and it is archaeology at the same time. Number 3, one-pot fish and tomato stew. The stew that survived because the ocean was on both sides. Along the coasts of West Africa, fish was not a luxury. It was the protein that kept coastal communities alive, abundant in the rivers and the ocean and the estuaries where fresh and salt water met. The stew built around it was the daily meal of millions of people for centuries before the transatlantic trade began. Firm, white fish, tilapia or catfish or whatever the water offered, cooked in a tomato and onion sauce built with palm oil, Scotch bonnet, smoked crayfish or dried shrimp for depth, and whatever aromatics were available. This recipe survived the crossing because fish was available on both sides of the Atlantic. African American communities in coastal states made versions of this stew that were recognizable to West Africans, even without the palm oil, even without the dried crayfish, even with catfish standing in for the tilapia of the Volta River. The flavor was different, but the intention was the same. A bold, spiced tomato broth that made the fish better than it would have been on its own, and that produced enough sauce to eat over rice for 2 days. The fish stew that appears in Gula Geechee cooking, in Louisiana Creole cooking, and African-American cooking up and down the eastern seaboard has this dish as its oldest ancestor. Number 2, African barbecue chicken skillet, Peri-Peri style, the fire chicken they never gave credit for. Peri-Peri is a small hot pepper native to southern Africa, brought to Portugal by explorers in the 15th century, and then spread through the Portuguese colonial trade network until it appeared in kitchens across 3 continents. The African version of Peri-Peri chicken, the original, was made by the indigenous people of Mozambique and Zimbabwe and South Africa long before the Portuguese arrived and is considerably more interesting than what the restaurant chains eventually did with it. Chicken marinated in a paste of peri-peri or any available hot pepper, garlic, lemon, smoked paprika, and oil. Then cooked over fire or in a heavy skillet until the skin was charred and the marinade had caramelized into a sticky, fiery glaze. African-American cooks who made this dish, and they did make it, often under other names, hot pepper chicken, fire chicken, grilled bird with sauce, were working from the same instinct that West African cooks had always worked from. That a bird should taste like something, that heat and acid and fat, applied correctly, could turn a simple chicken into something memorable. That instinct did not need a passport or a recipe card. It was carried in the hands and the taste memory of people who had always known how to cook. Number 1, savory bean cake and sauce, moi moi style, the dish that refused to be forgotten. We end with the most technically complex recipe on this list, and also the most emotionally significant. Moi moi is a Nigerian steamed bean pudding, made from black-eyed peas soaked overnight, peeled by rubbing them between your palms until the skin slipped off, then blended smooth with onion, Scotch bonnet, red bell pepper, crayfish, and salt into a paste the color of cream. Poured into small containers, sealed, and steamed for 45 minutes until they set into something firm on the outside and impossibly soft inside, almost silky, with a flavor that was at once mild and complex and deeply savory. This dish is number 1 not because it is the most famous or the most widely eaten, but because it represents something the other 24 recipes also represent, just more visibly: the absolute refusal of a people to let their food culture die. Moi cannot be made quickly, it cannot be made carelessly. Every step requires attention and knowledge and the physical memory of hands that have done it before. It was passed down in West African households for generations because it was too important not to pass down. It survived the Middle Passage because the knowledge of how to make it survived in the people who carried it. And today, in kitchens in Lagos and London and Atlanta and Houston, it is still being made the same way, with soaked beans and patient hands and the understanding that some things are worth the trouble. That is what this entire list has been about. Not just the flavor of these dishes, though the flavor is extraordinary. Not just their history, though the history is essential, but the fact that they survived, that they're here, that you can make them tonight in your own kitchen and taste something that has been traveling toward you for a very long time. Make one of these this week, not for a special occasion, on a Tuesday night when nothing is happening and the kitchen is quiet and you have a pot and an hour. Because these dishes were not made for celebrations. They were made for ordinary days, for the Tuesday nights that needed something warm, for the weeks when money was short and ingenuity was the only ingredient in surplus. And when you eat it, know what you're eating. Know that the peanut in the stew was planted by African hands in African soil. Know that the okra in the pot has a name that comes from a Bantu language. Know that the rice dish you thought was Southern was West African before it was anything else. Know that the people who created this food were brilliant and resourceful, and that they deserve to be named, not as footnotes, but as the originators. Tell us in the comments which dish you are making. Tell us if your grandmother made something that sounds like one of these. Tell us if you already knew some of this history, or if any of it surprised you. We read every comment. We answer every question. Because these recipes deserve to be in conversation, not just in pots. Subscribe, share this video with someone who needs to taste this history, and then go make something. The kitchen is waiting. The past is patient, and the food has been ready for a long time.